Mayor, you won't believe what went down in court today. Tiffany Henyard just had the most embarrassing moment of her career in front of a packed courtroom, with cameras rolling. The judge had barely finished reading the verdict when Henyard stormed out in a fit of rage, creating a scene that could have come straight out of a political drama. But what exactly pushed her to this breaking point? Was it the avalanche of corruption allegations finally catching up with her, the shocking financial secrets exposed for all to see, or perhaps the fact that her own supporters turned against her after months of dodging accusations of excessive spending, power-hungry antics, and shady transactions? Whatever it was, today, it all came crashing down. Her departure wasn't graceful, not even close. It was a dramatic, angry stomp out of the courtroom, leaving the room in stunned silence and whispers of outrage. People couldn't stop talking. What exactly happened in that room? What did the judge say to set her off? More importantly, is this the beginning of the end for Dalton's most controversial mayor? Hold tight, because things are about to get wild. The courtroom was packed with reporters, political analysts, and regular citizens, all eager to see Tiffany Henyard finally held accountable for her actions. This wasn't just any trial, it was a public reckoning for a politician whose name had been making headlines for all the wrong reasons. When the judge took his seat, the room fell into total silence. Cameras clicked, pens scratched furiously against notepads, and social media exploded with rumors as the prosecutor began detailing the shocking evidence against her. For months, accusations of corruption, abuse of public funds, and power misuse had mounted against Henyard. The evidence had reached a boiling point. Tiffany entered the room with noticeably less bravado than usual, a stark contrast to her former flashy, confident persona. Gone were the designer outfits and cocky attitude, replaced by a somber expression. As the prosecutor began listing each shady deal, unethical decision, and taxpayer dollar that had mysteriously disappeared, Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, stealing nervous glances at her legal team, who sat stiffly beside her, fully aware of what was coming. Then came the bombshell. The prosecutor began detailing a $43,000 Amazon spending spree, first-class flights, and luxury hotel stays. Tiffany remained still at first, likely thinking it was just another minor inconvenience, a misunderstanding, or politically motivated attack. But as each accusation piled up, her confidence began to crumble. The evidence was irrefutable, and the jury, many of them once her most loyal supporters, couldn't ignore the truth. Things got even worse as the prosecutor unveiled fresh evidence, including newly disclosed documents linking Henyard directly to a series of back-to-back transactions that funneled public funds into private accounts. Screenshots of emails, wire transfers, and confidential agreements flashed across the courtroom screen, leaving the audience in shock. Whispers of disbelief filled the room as Henyard's lawyer scrambled to fight back, but the damning evidence was overwhelming. Tiffany's carefully crafted persona as an untouchable, fearless leader started to crack. Her eyes flickered toward the exit as she considered making a break for it. At that moment, the judge's voice cut through the noise, bringing the room back to attention. The defense tried to argue that the evidence had been misinterpreted, claiming Tiffany was simply the target of a political smear campaign. They argued it was an attack on a strong, powerful woman in leadership, but their efforts were falling flat. The truth was clear, and Tiffany could no longer deny it. The prosecutor described a long pattern of manipulation, deceit, and fraud. It was revealed that while Tiffany claimed to be a champion for the people, she had been using Dalton's resources to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Meanwhile, the residents of Dalton dealt with cuts to essential services, tax hikes, and crumbling infrastructure. As the reality sank in, the outrage in the room was palpable. And then came the final blow. A key witness, once a trusted member of Henyard's inner circle, took the stand. The courtroom held its breath as this longtime ally turned accuser began exposing the toxic culture behind the scenes. There were tales of corruption, intimidation, and threats against anyone who dared to speak out. It wasn't just a political scandal, it was the unraveling of a regime built on lies and fear. Tiffany's face froze as shock and fury washed over her. She had always believed she could talk her way out of anything, convinced she was untouchable and that no one could break the narrative she had carefully crafted. But as the walls closed in around her, she realized that this time was different. The judge called for a break, giving both sides a chance to regroup before the final decision was read. Tiffany stood up from her chair, gripping the edge of the table as if she might tear it apart. Her lawyers tried to calm her down, but Tiffany had never been one to sit quietly. She had built her career on dominating every situation, but as she stormed out of the courtroom, her reputation was in ruins. And she was about to learn just how hard it is to escape the truth. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Tiffany, the once unstoppable mayor of Dalton, had never backed down from a challenge. But today, as the evidence stacked against her, everything seemed to be unraveling. The room fell into eerie silence when Tiffany's outburst echoed through the courthouse. She had always prided herself on controlling the narrative and making herself the center of attention with her commanding presence. But this time, she did the opposite. When the judge stood to leave, Tiffany leaped to her feet, shouting, "This is a setup. This is all lies. You just can't handle a powerful black woman with strength." The prosecutor, unfazed, folded his arms and watched as she imploded. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to record the outburst, and security rushed in to intervene, urging Tiffany to calm down. But she wasn't finished. "You'll regret this," she yelled, her voice vibrating with fury. "You think I'm going down, but I'm not going anywhere." She stormed toward the door, but as she reached it, the atmosphere in the room shifted. A group of federal agents, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. Tiffany froze. The expression that had once marked her every move, one of strength and confidence, was replaced by genuine fear. The lead agent raised a document in front of her and said, "We need you to accompany us." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even Tiffany's most devoted supporters were struck mute. The woman who had once dominated every room with her strength and fiery presence now stood cornered. She had imagined many things today: tough questions, negative news, maybe even a preliminary decision from the judge. But not this. Not the arrival of federal agents. They weren't just there to observe, they had a mission. And that mission was her. The weight of the document in the agent's hand seemed to press against Tiffany's chest, threatening to crush every ounce of control she had. Her fists clenched, and she squared her shoulders, refusing to show fear. "This is harassment, political persecution," she snapped, her voice ringing out. Her lawyers rushed to intervene, pushing in front of her, whispering urgently, "We need to leave now. Don't say anything, just go." But Tiffany wasn't one to back down. She shot the lead agent a glare that could have burned a hole in the wall. "This is political persecution," she repeated, her voice louder this time, as her lawyers frantically tried to usher her away. The scene had reached a tipping point, and this was just the beginning of a much bigger mess. This time, the federal agents stood their ground, unfazed. "We need you to accompany us for additional questioning, Miss Henyard. This is not an arrest. Yet." The emphasis on "yet" didn't go unnoticed. Tiffany's mind raced. Why were federal agents here now? Before the judge had even rendered a decision, she knew investigations were underway, but those close to her had assured her she was safe. Safe from what? Why were they here now? As reporters quickly realized what was happening, the atmosphere became chaotic. Phones shot up, cameras flashed, and social media erupted. Tiffany's meltdown was unfolding live, for millions to witness. Her supporters were stunned, some in disbelief, others shouting words of encouragement, "It's all a setup. She's innocent." But the cracks in her support were starting to show. Whispers of doubt rippled through the ranks. This was no longer just a trial, it had become a spectacle, a public execution of her career. Tiffany, once a fierce and untouchable leader, now seemed more like a liability than the powerhouse she had once been. Her aura of invincibility had evaporated. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, urging her to move. "Let us go now." "Move," he whispered urgently. Tiffany's face burned with humiliation as she shoved her way through the courtroom doors, flanked by agents on both sides. The walk down the courthouse hallway felt like a never-ending nightmare. Cameras followed her every move, capturing her descent from power. Reporters narrated the scene as if it were a thriller, each word deepening the humiliation she was enduring. "Is this the beginning of the end for Tiffany Henyard?" one commentator asked, as if the story had already been written. Outside, it was even worse. A frenzy of reporters gathered, hurling questions at her as she was led toward a waiting federal vehicle. "Tiffany, will you step down? Is it true the FBI is investigating you?" The media onslaught was relentless. Tiffany didn't answer. Her face twitched with irritation, but she knew better than to give them another soundbite. She had learned the hard way how much damage a single quote could do. Instead, she focused on damage control. Her PR team was already scrambling behind the scenes, leaking statements to label the federal action as nothing more than a political witch hunt, an attempt to silence a strong leader shaking up the system. But the leaks from within the investigation told a different story. The walls were closing in, and it wasn't just corruption Tiffany was under investigation for. There were allegations of financial mismanagement, intimidation tactics, and even secret offshore accounts. As the leaks continued, the situation grew more dire. Whistleblowers came forward, confirming suspicions that taxpayer money had been siphoned off, funds that should have gone to community programs were funneled into shady consulting fees and projects that never materialized. The deeper the investigation went, the uglier the picture became. Then came the bombshell: a secret audio recording surfaced online. It allegedly captured a conversation between Tiffany and a close ally, discussing ways to discredit and intimidate political opponents. The voice was unmistakable, even if the video was blurry. "They wouldn't dare criticize me," the voice sneered. "And if they do, we'll make sure they regret it." The audio clip went viral in an instant. Hashtags like Henyard Expose and Justice for City flooded social media. Memes comparing her to notorious corrupt politicians overtook timelines. Tiffany's supporters, once fierce, now found themselves questioning everything. Her inner circle was in free fall, consumed by fear. Desperate to save face, they rushed to discredit the tape, claiming it had been manipulated. PR statements flooded the media, but the damage was done. The cracks in her image were showing. Former allies, once her most loyal supporters, began distancing themselves. "If these allegations are true, we expect full accountability," one politician cautiously remarked, testing the waters. Even the media, which had once hailed her as a champion of the people, was shifting its tone. A prime-time anchor who had once been a fierce defender of Henyard now said, "The walls are closing in on Tiffany Henyard, and this time, there may be no escape." Inside the interrogation room, Tiffany sat across from a group of federal agents, trying her best to maintain the composure she was known for. But even she couldn't hide the signs of weakness. The defiant, unshakable leader was crumbling. "We only have a few questions," the lead investigator said calmly, setting a thick folder on the table in front of her. Tiffany leaned back in her chair, forcing a laugh. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "You have nothing on me." The investigator didn't respond right away. Instead, he flipped open the folder, slid a page across the table, and pointed to it. Tiffany's eyes followed, and the smile on her face began to fade as she saw the document, a bank statement showing a sizable deposit from an unidentified shell company linked to a government contract. Her breath caught in her throat. "What's this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The investigator flipped the page. Another document appeared, an email exchange about favors for certain donors. Tiffany swallowed hard. The walls were closing in, faster than she could fight back. Then, the final blow. The investigator slid one last piece of paper across the table, a signed document bearing her signature, approving a deal flagged as suspicious. The investigator leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You can continue pretending, or you can start talking. Because right now, we have enough to take this all the way." For the first time that day, Tiffany Henyard had no words. Her bravado had vanished. The once invincible politician was now cornered, her future slipping through her fingers. Outside, the world continued to move on. Reporters prepared their evening broadcasts, social media buzzed with debates about who would replace her, and the citizens of Dalton anxiously awaited the next chapter in the scandal. Tiffany Henyard, the woman who had once ruled Dalton with an iron fist, was now a woman without a future, standing on the brink of her own downfall. The question was no longer whether she would fall, but how far she would fall before it was all over. Tiffany Henyard, once a dominant force in politics known for her boldness and ability to manipulate any situation, now found herself sitting stiffly in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The woman who had effortlessly commanded every room she entered, bending situations to her will with her sharp tongue and unmatched charisma, was now trapped. Her arms crossed, her polished nails tapping nervously as she faced the reality of her situation. Nervously, Tiffany tapped her polished nails against the cold metal table. The silence in the room was heavy, oppressive. The lead investigator, calm and collected, flipped through a thick file, breaking the silence. "Miss Henyard," he began, "we've dealt with politicians like you before. They all think they're untouchable until they're not." He looked up, his expression unreadable. Tiffany, always quick with a retort, forced a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is absurd," she said, her voice laced with defiance. "A smear campaign. You have no case." The investigator raised an eyebrow, unfazed. He slid another document across the table. A sworn statement from a former aide, a person who had attended several critical meetings and now decided to expose information Tiffany had desperately hoped would remain hidden. Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. Her world, once unshakable, began to crumble. She glanced toward the door, half expecting her lawyers to rush in and save her. But no one came. She was alone. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Henyard felt fear, deep, real fear. The fallout from the federal investigation was swift and explosive. News of Tiffany's interrogation spread like wildfire, and political analysts began speculating about the extent of the corruption. Many compared her potential downfall to some of the most infamous scandals in history, while others predicted jail time if the accusations held up. It was no longer just a smear campaign, it had turned into a full-scale political earthquake. The city council, once her group of loyal allies, turned on her. One trustee declared, "We can no longer stand by while taxpayer money is squandered. This administration has failed our city." An emergency session was called, and public sentiment shifted. Tiffany's closest allies, once her strongest supporters, began distancing themselves. The media, which had long praised her strength, now portrayed her as a failed leader. Tiffany, unwilling to go down without a fight, rushed to control the narrative. Her team released a carefully crafted video message, filled with the usual talking points: defiance, denial, and accusations of political persecution. "I've devoted my life to serving this city," she said, her voice unwavering. "The truth will be revealed. I will not be intimidated." But the response was overwhelming. The public wasn't buying it. Social media exploded with condemnation. "Where's the fake news now? We have documents, recordings, and witnesses. You're done." Critics and even former supporters alike called for her resignation. Desperate to salvage what was left, Tiffany called a press conference, but it was no use. "I'm being targeted because I refuse to play by their rules," she declared fiercely. But even she couldn't ignore the reality closing in. The media, hungry for answers, relentlessly pressed her on the leaked bank records and audio tapes in which she appeared to threaten political opponents. Tiffany, once untouchable, was now visibly rattled. The story was no longer in her control. Then came the ultimate blow. After days of speculation, the FBI, with the support of state officials, executed a search warrant at Tiffany's residence and workplace. The sight of federal agents removing laptops, hard drives, and boxes of documents from her home sent shockwaves through the city. But the true symbol of her fall from grace came when Tiffany was arrested. Caught in handcuffs, her face etched with disbelief, the image spread like wildfire. The once powerful politician was now the face of a scandal of monumental proportions. News outlets scrambled to cover the unfolding drama. Legal experts appeared on television, explaining the severity of the charges: fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bribery. If convicted, Tiffany could face over 20 years in prison. Public opinion shifted once more, and the weight of the evidence against her seemed insurmountable. A plea deal seemed like her only way out. As Tiffany sat in a holding cell, her world fell apart. It wasn't just the charges, it was the complete destruction of her public image. Her team worked tirelessly to contain the damage, scrambling to find any angle that could salvage her reputation. But the tide had already turned. Within hours, her political allies had released statements calling for justice and accountability. Even those who had been closest to her were now distancing themselves. But Tiffany wasn't ready to go down quietly. From behind bars, she sent one final message to her lawyers: "This is not the truth. The truth will be revealed." Was it a desperate threat or a final act of rebellion? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: Tiffany Henyard's reign was over. Her story was no longer about power and control. It had become a tale of corruption, deceit, and the collapse of a political empire. In the end, the question lingered: did Tiffany Henyard get what she deserved, or was there more to the story than the public knew? As the city waited for the next chapter of Tiffany Henyard's downfall, one thing was clear: her political career was finished. The people who had once supported her were now watching, waiting for the consequences to unfold. The narrative of her rise to power had been eclipsed by the tragic tale of her fall. The media, already moving on to other scandals, couldn't help but wonder if there was still more to come. What secrets did Tiffany Henyard still hold? Could she mount a comeback, or was this the end of her political career? Only time would tell. But history had shown that even the most corrupt politicians could sometimes find a way back. Would Tiffany Henyard be the exception, or was this the final chapter in the story of a once great leader's demise? Only the coming days would reveal the truth behind the scandal.